Good morning. Welcome to episode 24 of the Hockey Variety Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I managed to get a middle of the week episode in. Well, it's Tuesday. I'll probably post it Tuesday too. And I should have a bit of time tomorrow to maybe kind of pre-plan a couple episodes. We'll see. And yeah, don't have too much in store today. This should end up being a pretty quick episode, but we'll see. You guys that listen to the podcast regularly know that I like to ramble. So we'll see. This could end up getting closer to the 1 hour mark than I might think. And yeah, I'm actually not going to be talking too much about current events today. I'm going to talk about the Big City Green Classic or whatever it was called, the animated hockey game that the NHL did with ESPN and Disney. And I'm also going to talk about some NHL Award Snubs. Okay, so guys who maybe should have won an award in a particular year and didn't because of reasons. Okay, so I'm gonna get into a few of those, but first I want to talk about my rec hockey game the other day. I played. It was our last regular season game. I managed to make it out, and it was against a team that I've heard is very, very scrappy, very chippy, and I haven't actually played against that team yet. This was our fourth time against them, and I haven't been able to make any of the games. So I was really looking forward to this one. And I did not expect it to get this chippy. It was insane. And I I've never acted like that. Like I've retaliated, I've stood up for teammates, but that game was a whole nother level. I was mouthing off like crazy. I was really butting heads with this one guy. And it was just nuts. I don't know what to say. I was saying things that I like could never imagine myself saying. I was definitely, trying to do the whole tough guy thing. And it was funny because in the first I was butting heads with this guy, right? And for the record though, like I made a pretty normal hockey play, and then he's telling me like, "You gonna take one? Like you gonna take a penalty?" I'm like, "Dude, like shut up, leave me alone." Um, and he was just like so emotional about it, and we're like barking at each other in the penalty box too. And then the next shift, we're both on the ice. Oh man, he skates around me and scores a breakaway goal. It was just like, oh man, yeah, it was definitely that definitely stung. And they ended up winning the game too. And for the record, like chippiness aside, they were the better team. I thought. They were also the chippier team. I thought they were starting everything. And I was just like, I was saying stuff I never would have said. Like it was kind of out of character for me, I thought, but memorable nonetheless. And especially like once we hit the second intermission, I told my guys like, "Hey guys, I'm gonna shut up from now on. I'm starting to kind of go a bit overboard here. I'm surprised I only got the one unsportsmanlike conduct penalty, to be honest, but yeah, it was crazy. That same guy, he took a really hard shot and it hit my D partner really hard. He was on the ice and he skates over and he does the whole like one knee apologize thing. And I just went over to him and I'm like, "Hey, so you're a gentleman now?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm always a gentleman." And I just told him to F off. Like, pretty unsportsmanlike by me, I would say. But honestly, I got no regrets. But I really hope that doesn't end up being my last game of the season because we're entering the round robin of the playoffs here, and I'm going on a little vacation with my lady, and I can't make any of the round robin games. I'll be back in time for the playoff rounds, like the semifinals and stuff, but we have to qualify first. And I believe in my guys. I think they'll get the job done. We got to finish top 4 out of 7. Sorry, the cat's doing some crazy stuff in the background there. I trust my guys, and I'm hoping to play in the semis when we get back to it. So, yeah. Anyways, let's get into the show. I'm just going to kick this cat out of the office really quick here. All right, so he knew I was mad at him and ran away. So that works too. Cats, right? Okay, so first thing I want to talk about the Big City Greens Classic, which was a little collaboration between Disney and ESPN. Well, Disney owns ESPN, but yeah, they basically did a live animated hockey game. So what they did is they did the whole player tracking thing, and they used animated sprites to pretty much replicate the game, but as a cartoon. And they had a bunch of other silly stuff in there too. Um, and overall, I thought it was really good, actually. And I only caught the highlights. I didn't get to catch the whole game. I wish I did. Um, But you got to remember too, like the hockey boomers aren't gonna like this kind of stuff because they don't like change. But you got to remember, this is for kids, okay? And it's not just for kids. This is for like small kids. I would say like younger children, because just watch the highlights and you'll know what I mean. There was some bugginess that I know people are gonna dunk on the internet if they haven't already, where like after a team scores a goal, when they would like kind of come together to celebrate, it seems like everyone was skating backwards. There was a lot of backwards skating that didn't actually happen live. Just watch some of the highlights, you'll know what I mean. So I think they got some bugs they need to kind of, they got some things they need to fix if they're going to do this again. But honestly, I thought it was a fun time. I think it was good. I think Kevin Weeks did a really good job. He did some of like the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Just kind of like some of the commentary stuff, and in the intermission he'd do like a demonstration, but he was all animated, and I thought it was really cool. I really did. I hope they do more stuff like this. As long as they're getting positive reception from the kids, which, as far as I'm aware, they did. I think they should keep doing this. I like this. I really do. And I do want to catch one of these animated games sometime live. Because, yeah, this it looks like a lot of fun. I think it's a good idea. And they were posting, the NHL posted this on YouTube Kids, which I thought was kind of cool. Which is nice because that means the comments are turned off, so you don't get those angry hockey boomers saying whatever on the YouTube page. But speaking of the NHL's YouTube page, I have to mention this, okay? And I know this is a family-friendly podcast, and you might have seen this already if you're looking at the screen. But the thumbnail choice, the choice of thumbnail for one of their YouTube videos, Ovechkin getting closer to the scoring milestone. And the thumbnail is, well, there's Brett Hull, an animated Brett Hull in the background, and Ovechkin climbing the stairs, and the still they used, little suggestive, we'll say. I mean, all I'm saying is I'm surprised nobody looked at that and was like, hey, maybe we should play the video for another second and then screenshot, or just use a totally different thumbnail. And I checked right before, I took that screenshot on my phone like 20 minutes after the video was posted. I checked right before hopping on the pod. This is still the thumbnail. And I don't know if anyone else is talking about it. Again, I apologize for talking about some pretty mature content on this podcast. But I suggest they change that thumbnail because that looks kinda, yeah. So yeah, that's all I'm gonna say about that thumbnail. But I hope they do this again. I really do. I think it's a good idea. I think it's a good way to kind of spark some more engagement in for the NHL at that younger generation. Because we do need kids getting involved in hockey, and if these animated games gets at least a few kids interested in playing hockey, then I think it's a success. Really, I don't think they need to do this to completely convert a whole generation to hockey. But if it's getting more kids interested in the game, I'm happy. I think it's a success. So I'm going to be spending the bulk of today's podcast talking about NHL Awards Snubs. Okay, so guys who maybe should have won an award in a given year and didn't get the award for reasons. Okay, and I think I have four, I don't want to call pretty clear snubs, but four cases that I think are worth discussing. And then I have a few other little bonus bits at the end here. So again, this should end up being a pretty short podcast. I don't have a fantasy pick this episode, so sorry. And I mean, it's the middle of the week too. I like doing the fantasy picks on the weekend before the following week. Also, for Yahoo leagues, it's pretty much the start of playoffs for the Yahoo leagues. I got my quarterfinals in both my leagues. We'll see how they go. I've gotten off to a pretty good start in both of them. There's one I'm pretty confident I'll win, but the other one, I don't know. I've been middle of the pack all season, so we'll see. But yeah, NHL awards. So just a bit of context too. There are definitely arguments that there's some arguments for snubs that I'm not including on this too. I tried to pick the ones that the ones I want to talk about, the ones that I think are a bit more clear than others. I also left off a few trophies too, just the ones that would be really tough to do for this. So like the Lady Bing, the Masterton Trophy. I don't talk too much about the first and second team All Star game, or the the first and second team All Star list. They do that little ranking that I don't think too many people pay attention to. Though I do have it on this first slide that you're probably waiting for me to talk about, which I will in a second. Okay, I completely lost my train of thought. I had to restart that. So, yeah, I don't talk about the Lady Bing. I don't talk about the Masterton. I chose not to talk about the Selkie either. Just because I feel like the Selkie Trophy, it's a, how do I word this? Like, they tend to give it, they seems like they give it to guys that are due, and I really don't like it when voters do that. It's a bit of a tough trophy to rank too, because you have, it's balancing offense with defensive stats, and I didn't really want to do that big of a deep dive. I mean, I did do a kind of a deep dive for this list. This took me about an hour to prepare still. And yeah, so, and I didn't talk about the Pearson either, because then you're talking about players voting and, or what is it? What do they call it? The Ted Lindsay now? I can't remember. It's the Pearson or the Lindsay. I also didn't talk about the Conn Smythe because I think with the Conn Smythe, some more of the intangibles get factored in there too. Take the 2018 Cup, for example. Like, Ovechkin got the Conn Smythe. I think Kuznetsov led in scoring, though. And I personally kind of thought Kuznetsov should have got it. But, you know, Ovechkin, you know, he's the leader on that team. Maybe that was part of it. He led the playoffs in goals. And also, who cares? I think both players are just happy they won the Stanley Cup. So I don't really want to talk about the Conn Smythe either, because there's a lot of different ways you could go with that too. So just the Hart Trophy, just the Vezina, just the Calder, and just the Norris. And I was actually fortunate enough to get one pick for each of those. So yeah, let's get into it. So let's talk about the Hart Trophy first. This is the snub that most people think of, and that is the 2002 Hart Trophy. So for the 2001-2002 season. So that was between Josie Theodore and Jerome McGinley. They finished with the same amount of votes. And in case you're wondering how the votes work, for most trophies, except for the Vezina, for most trophies, the voters will get pretty much a first place vote, a second place vote, a third, a fourth, and a fifth. And they are weighed a bit differently. Like, a first place vote weighs more than a second place vote or a third or whatever, right? In fact, if you look at the bottom of the screen there, just for reference, you can see Curtis Joseph had one third place vote, and Felix Potvin had one second place vote. And you can see that registers as a higher vote total. So you can see from that example at the bottom of the screen there that a second place vote has more weight than a third place vote. So you might be wondering, why did Josie Theodore win over Jerome McGinley if their vote total was the same? Well, as far as I'm aware, the tiebreaker is the number of first place votes. And as you can see, Josie Theodore had 3 more first place votes than McGinley. This was an incredibly close vote. I think that goes without saying. This is probably the closest Hart Trophy vote in history, I'm going to say. And, you know, a lot of people look at this and they think that McGinley got snubbed, right? And I see the argument. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big Jerome McGinley fan. And that's coming from a Sharks fan too, right? Like, I'm not supposed to like Calgary, but it was really tough to root against McGinley. He was a very humble player, Canadian, played a big role in that 2010 gold medal for Canada. Like, I was a big fan of Jerome McGinley. And that's nothing against Josie Theodore, but I think some people, including myself, will have a bit of bias when it comes to this vote because we really wanted Jerome McGinley to win that Hart Trophy. I totally get it. Another factor at play here is you're comparing goalie stats to player stats. And that is tricky. And that comes up again later in this list too. And it's really tough. Like, how do you compare like the number of wins for a goalie to the number of points for a player, or save percentage to points or goals? Like, it's tricky. It's important to note that Ginla won the Rocket Richard, and I believe the Art Ross as well this season. So most goals and most points. Theodore also won the Vezina too. I'll get into that in a sec because there's a reason I have that on the screen. And it's tough to compare. Another thing too, and I like to think of this as the Taylor Hall effect. When you're voting for the Hart Trophy, which is which player is MVP to their team. So it's not necessarily the best player in the league, though it kind of is. It's tough because like I think a lot of people don't really stick to the exact definition of the trophy, and as a result, we get some kind of like craziness going on, right? Like take this year's Hart Trophy race. Like McDavid has been the clear favorite all season, and if I had a vote, which I really hope I do get a vote someday, I'm never going to, but that'd be cool. McDavid would get my vote too. And that's just because he's putting up just insane totals that we haven't seen since like Mario Lemieux. However, if you're talking about which player is the MVP to their team, I mean, I still pick McDavid, but how do you weigh that, right? And when Taylor Hall won the Hart Trophy, he had like a 40-point lead over the next guy on his team. That team just got into the playoffs. They arguably got into the playoffs because of Taylor Hall. So there's a lot of things to consider. And one thing I have for the Theodore and Iginla debate here is that Montreal just squeaked into the playoffs. I have the 8th and 9th place up there. They just got into the playoffs ahead of Washington that year. While Calgary, with Jerome Iginla, finished quite a bit outside the playoffs. They finished 15 points outside of the playoffs. And I think that's part of it. I think that's something you have to consider because I think with Taylor Hall winning the Hart Trophy a few years ago, though I guess it was like 5 or 6 years ago now, part of that was because New Jersey just got into the playoffs. And whether or not the team gets into the playoffs or not, it is a factor. I don't know if it was a factor back in 2001, 2002, but it is a factor now. I think there was one year where maybe it was McDavid didn't get a ton of Hart consideration because the Oilers weren't making the playoffs that year. So it's something they talk about now, but I don't know if this wasn't factor back then. So assuming it was a factor, I would give the edge to Theodore in that. Theodore had a lot of starts that season too. He got credit for 64 out of 82 games played, which is a lot for a goalie. I mean, there was goalies back then playing like 70 plus games a season. And I know his win-loss record isn't like head-turning, but when you play 64 games and you put up a 931, that is very impressive. But the question is a 931 in 64 games comparable to a 96-point season by Iginla with 52 goals? It's really tough to compare those two. I don't envy the voters on this one. There was a bit of like a conspiracy about like a French-Canadian voter giving an edge to Theodore. I think I heard something about that a while ago. I'm not going to hold that to too much weight because you can see that there's guys who got first place votes, like Ron Francis getting a first place vote, which I'll talk about hipster picks later on. But in terms of like that French-Canadian voter conspiracy, whatever, I mean, you could say that some other guy should have given his vote to Theodore or Iginla or whatever. Like I don't think there's too much weight there, especially when the total votes between these two guys is tied. So this is a tricky one. Another thing I wanted to note is the Vezina Trophy voting that season. This is such a weird year. So Theodore, who was won the Hart, he finished with the same amount of Vezina votes as Patrick Waugh, and I'm assuming the tiebreaker for that one was also first place votes. So not only did Theodore barely win the Hart Trophy, but he also barely won the Vezina Trophy. And I think it was odd because when you look at Theodore's stats and Patrick Waugh's stats, and again, this is going to come up later in the podcast too. So Waugh had 2 more wins, but he had 0.6% less of a save percentage than Theodore, which it makes you wonder, like, how do you compare that? How do you weigh that? Personally, I look at that and I think Theodore should have won the Vezina by a bit more of a margin. I don't think it should have been that close, especially since there's the argument. I know this isn't the Hart Trophy, but there's a bit more of an argument that like, okay, so Theodore played a bigger role for his team than Waugh, probably. I can't remember where the Avalanche finished that season, but they just came off a Stanley Cup. You got to think they have a pretty good roster, right? I mean, you can see Joe Sakic is up there in the Hart Trophy voting too. So, yeah. And then here's another thing that baffles me. So, Theodore wins the Hart, he wins the Vezina, but you can see in the bottom left corner of your screen there, he was on the second All-Star team, and Waugh finished ahead of him. Very weird. I don't understand that at all. I'm gonna think that I think that maybe it's a different committee of voters for the All-Star team. Not that anyone really cares about the All-Star team that much, but the first and second All-Star team, or whatever you want to call it. This was a really weird year for voting. So just talking about the snub, let's say. So Theodore over Iginla. If I were to pick a winner today, it's really tough. Like, I can't. My bias wants to pick Iginla. I think overall Iginla is a more praised player than Theodore. I mean, he's a Hall of Famer, right? Like, it's tough. I don't want to put myself in that position. But just considering the win-loss record too, today I think I would still give the edge to Iginla, especially if people were voting as they do today. But I think if you're an Iginla fan and you think you got snubbed, this is a really close vote, and I think there's a really fair argument for both players. I really do. This is a tough vote, and I don't think you can just straight up say Iginla got snubbed, because Theodore definitely deserved to be in that conversation of first or second. This is a really, really tough year. But let's talk about a different one. This is like the big one, but I do have some other ones here that might not get talked about quite as much. And that was actually the following season, 2002-2003, the Calder Trophy. This is a weird one, and this is one that people talk about because the winner was kind of random, but I don't think it gets talked about enough of Zetterberg getting snubbed out of the Calder. So Barrett Jackman, rookie defenseman for the St. Louis Blues, wins the Calder Trophy over, most notably, Henrik Zetterberg, but you see Rick Nash is there too. But, I mean, the big race was between Zetterberg and Barrett Jackman. So, if you look at rookie forward point total over the years, this wasn't like a groundbreaking year for Zetterberg. Now, he led rookies in scoring that season, but, he didn't even hit the 50-point mark. I feel like the bar is quite a bit higher now. But here's the thing. Like, when you look at Jackman finishing first in the trophy, so he only had 19 points, and he played, I believe, a full season too. Only 19 points, and that's not a lot for a defenseman. Now, I didn't look too much at the advanced stats, but he wasn't up there in time on ice. I think he was paired with Al McGinnis all season. He finished 12th in team scoring too. And I know being a good defenseman, it's not all about the offense, but I think if you're in the Calder conversation, history tells us, I mean, when you look at Makar and Quinn Hughes in that one Calder race a few years ago, that was just who's the better offensive defenseman. They were looking at the offensive stats, and that was it. And then Makar just edged out Hughes. I think Makar had more goals, and goals tend to hold a bit more weight than assists, I find, when it comes to award voting. If two guys have the same amount of points, you kind of give the edge to the guy who has more goals, especially if it's a pretty drastic difference. But 19 points as a defenseman compared to 44 points from a forward, I think Zetterberg got snubbed here. And I think sometimes we forget that the Calder Trophy, it's not about who's going to be the best player someday. It's about just looking at that rookie season as a whole. And again, I didn't get too much into advanced stats here, because I think you have to consider that when looking at a defenseman against a forward like this. But Jackman wasn't up there in overall defensive scoring. His plus minus is pretty good. I wonder if plus minus held a bit more weight back then than it did. I mean, he was on a really good St. Louis team too. I don't know. If I were to do this, if I were just to revote, just looking just at this season, I'd give it to Zetterberg personally. I'm pretty surprised that Jackman won by that much too. He got quite a few first place votes. There has to be something with the advanced stats. There has to be something about Jackman that I don't know. But I think back then they really liked those big, strong defensemen, and it's kind of a boomer pick. I think, really, just looking at it, and it is tough. I think as a defenseman, as a rookie, because you really have to put up points. And I don't know, maybe Jackman is just one of those. Maybe he did a lot of the intangibles pretty well, but personally, I think this was a bit more of a boomer pick. I would have gone with Zetterberg personally. But when it's all said and done, I mean, Zetterberg, he's going to be a Hall of Famer someday, Stanley Cup champion. I do not think he cares that he didn't win the Calder that season. Now, here's a trophy snub that I feel like never gets talked about and should be talked about. I noticed this because I follow award voting pretty quickly, and I like looking at the historical side too. And you might have noticed I didn't go any further back than that Iginla Theodore one. Maybe I'll take a look at the 90s someday and see if there's anything that really stands out, or the 80s. And I know the award voting process has changed a lot since then, but this is a snub that I feel like doesn't get talked about enough. And this one I genuinely feel like was a snub. And that's nothing against Zdeno Chara, but I feel like Mike Green should have won the Norris this year with the Washington Capitals. And yeah, I know that sounds crazy. And maybe I put too much weight in the points totals by defensemen, but I don't think it gets noted enough that Mike Green had a phenomenal offensive season this year. Because not only did he have 23 more points than Chara, but he did it in 12 less games. I honestly, I'm really surprised. Green was over a point per game from the blue line, while Chara wasn't close. And again, I didn't look at the advanced stats too much. There's only so much available when you go this far back. I know it was only like 15 seasons ago or so, but I mean, when you look at the plus minus too, it's pretty much neck and neck. I took a look at the rosters too. I think there's a pretty fair argument. They have a pretty similar supporting cast around then. I mean, the Bruins are pretty good this season. I mean, there's an argument that maybe Chara's advanced stats maybe were better because Tim Thomas won the Vezina Trophy this year. They had a fantastic goalie in net. So it makes you wonder. And you could say, oh, but Mike Green had Alex Ovechkin on his team, right? But Green put up 31 goals as a defenseman in 68 games. Like, honestly, I look at this and I think Green should have won it this season. And I feel like this might have been one of those votes where it's like, okay, that guy was due. And that drives me crazy. I hate it when guys win awards because they're due. And that's a big reason why I don't like the Selke, because I feel like the Selke trophy voting is kind of a joke. I feel like it often goes to the guys that are due and not really to the guys who are statistically the best. Now, not always. And I'm not throwing any shade at like Bergeron or O'Reilly, but it kind of feels that way with the Selke. And I feel like with the 08-09 Norris, I feel like that was the case. I don't think they gave the award to the best defenseman. I think they gave it to a guy that was due. And honestly, I totally understand if you disagree. And again, maybe there's some advanced stats that I'm missing. But I know the Norris is not all about the offense. And I talk about this later in the podcast too. But, usually the offense is a measuring stick with the Norris. I mean, look at Erik Karlsson right now. He's the favorite for the Norris. He's been the favorite for the Norris all season. And go figure, it's the offense that's getting everybody's attention. So why was there a double standard here with Mike Green? Is it because he's not a big name? Is it because nobody talks about Mike Green anymore? I think that's silly. He should have won the Norris this year. And then the cherry on top, sarcastically, I guess, Mike Green finished second in Norris voting the following season too. Now, I can't remember who won, but it might have been Erik Karlsson. Well, maybe not, actually. That's kind of early for Karlsson. But anyways, Mike Green didn't win it the following season, but I feel like that wasn't quite as close. from what I remember. But yeah, I felt like Mike Green got snubbed this year, and that's no slight at Chara. I know this is Chara's only Norris, and if he didn't win it, maybe Chara never would have won a Norris. But what I say to that is, hey, you got to be better than the other defensemen. And hey, Chara, even without this Norris, he'd be a Hall of Famer. He has a Stanley Cup. Who cares? But yeah, I don't know. I think Mike Green got snubbed here personally. Okay, next up. This is actually the last one for the snubs I'm going to talk about. But Semyon Varlamov in 2013, 2014. Okay, so I have quite a bit to unpack here. So I'm not necessarily saying that Varlamov should have won the Hart this season. It's kind of like a Theodore Ginla situation too. If we're comparing Crosby to Varlamov from this season alone, because it's like, all right, Varlamov 41 wins, 14 losses, 6 overtime or shootout losses, and then a 927, which is a really insanely good season, I think. But how do you compare that to a 104-point season by Crosby? That's tough to compare. But the argument I want to make is I think Varlamov should have finished at least second place this season, okay? And I looked at, if you look at the screen there, the runner-ups were Ryan Getzlaf, Claude Giroux, and then Varlamov. And then I looked at the team stats too, because again, this is the MVP to your team, right? Not only did Colorado finish first in their division, but they didn't have a single player that finished a point per game that year. I think Matt Duchene might have been the closest. He might have finished just under a point per game. But every other team had a pretty good supporting cast. I know Anaheim had at least another player that was a point per game in Corey Perry. Crosby did have Malkin that season. Malkin missed about 20 games, I believe, but he was still over a point per game. Big surprise. And you know, Philly had a pretty good supporting cast there too. I think it's no question that Giroux was their MVP. But when I look at Giroux's totals, I look at Varlamov's totals, and I look at where their teams finished and how they ranked in comparison to their teammates, I'm picking Varlamov all day, and I'm ranking Varlamov ahead of Getzlaf as well. I think it's when you're comparing Crosby to Varlamov this season, it gets tough. It's a little tough to compare to. And I wonder if the name recognition comes into play. I know Crosby had a Hart Trophy by this point, but it makes you wonder, does him being Sidney Crosby give him an edge in this, which I don't think is fair. It is tough to compare those two, but Varlamov should have been a nominee for the Hart Trophy that season. And then on top of that, Varlamov got snubbed for the Vezina Trophy as well. And I'm going to say snubbed because, you know, with the Vezina Trophy, it's pretty black and white. It's like, okay, you're looking at wins, you're looking at games started, and you're looking at save percentage. Those are the big ones. Shutouts don't get quite as much notoriety, but the big ones are wins, save percentage, and games started. And when you're looking at Tuukka Rask beating out Varlamov for the Vezina, I don't know about that because, you know, Varlamov had 5 more wins. He only played a few more games, so I'm not going to consider the games played too much because it's pretty close, but he had 5 more wins, and his save percentage was only like 3 points less, okay? You're comparing a 927 to a 930 from Rask. And again, I know this isn't the Hart Trophy, so I don't want to look too much at the supporting cast, but the Boston Bruins are pretty good. And the Colorado Avalanche, I mean, they had a good season, but it was the Varlamov show that year. And I personally think he got snubbed. I know it's a bit closer for Varlamov with the Vezina than it was the Hart Trophy. And I know we can't really compare Hart Trophy consideration to Vezina because you have the team MVP side of things too. And then you have the whether or not the team made the playoffs and all that. But I think Varlamov got snubbed of a nomination for the Hart at the very least. I think he's in the conversation that maybe he should have won it over Crosby. But that's a very tough comparison because it's forward production against goalie production. it's tough to make that kind of like conversion of comparing the two. But I think he got snubbed of the Vezina, and I don't know if this was around the time Varlamov. I know I think there was some like domestic violence allegations that didn't go through. Um, and my argument to that is Patrick Kane won the Hart Trophy, and he had allegations against him, which again also didn't go through. Does it have something to do with him being Russian? I personally think there's a bit of Russian discrimination in the league when it comes to stuff like this. And I'm not trying to take anything away from Crosby. He had a phenomenal season. Art Ross Trophy this season as well. The only player to crack 100 points. But I have a feeling that might have been a factor too. I feel like some Russian players get some discrimination when it comes to this stuff, especially when your name was in the media for some negative reasons. I don't know if those allegations were after this season or before. I really don't. But they were just allegations when it was all said and done, right? I mean, he didn't get shipped back to Russia like Slava Voinov did. So definitely different circumstances. But yeah, I feel like Varlamov got snubbed. I feel like he was easily the MVP of his team, the best goalie that season. Pretty sure, yeah, he was the only goalie to crack 40 wins that season too, which is something you never see anymore because you get a good balance between the backup and the starter. But yeah, this is one that never gets talked about because it's Sidney Crosby, right? He's got the name. Why would you talk about someone other than Sidney Crosby for this year? I don't really think it was totally fair. And the fact that Varlamov only got one first place vote, I think is pretty insane. I think it should have been a lot closer. Again, not saying he should have won the Hart, but he should have been at least second. That's the argument I'm trying to make here. Okay, so I'm done with the trophy snubs, but there's two last things I want to talk about. And the first one, it just has to do more so with voting rather than winners and losers and all of that. So this is something that drove me crazy, and it's not because of the player. It's because of the standard when it comes to Norris Trophy, okay? When people are voting for the Norris Trophy, I already said this in this podcast, they really look at the offensive stats. Probably too much. Probably more than they should. I feel like these days they should be looking at the defensive side a bit more. And, and that balance, right? Like Cale Makar winning the Norris last season, he put up great point totals, but he was also fantastic defensively. So I feel like they got it right that year, though you could have given it to Yossi as well. Yossi had a phenomenal season as well. But the point is, the guy who leads defensemen in points is always in the mix, okay? The last time a guy led defensemen in points but didn't get nominated was Gonchar, and that was about 2 decades ago. And Gonchar finished 4th in voting that season. And the player I want to talk about, this isn't like the wacky COVID year where they had like the Canadian division and stuff. Tyson Barrie led all defensemen in points, barely. He had one more point than Adam Fox, who ended up winning the award. Tyson Barrie led all defensemen in points and didn't get, hear me out, he didn't get a single Norris Trophy vote. Not even a 5th place vote. He's the first player in NHL history for that to happen to, and I do not think that is fair whatsoever, considering the criteria we have for the Norris Trophy, okay? I'm not saying Tyson Barrie should have won the Norris. I'm not even saying he should have been nominated. I'm not even saying he should have been top 10, okay? I'm saying Tyson Barrie should have, without a doubt, gotten at least one 5th place vote, okay? Just by the definition of the award and the award voters being consistent with the criteria of the awards, okay? The guy who leads defensemen in points, and I know it's not all about points, they should be they should get at least a 5th place vote. That's all I'm saying. Like, this is totally insane and inconsistent to me. I can't believe this didn't get talked about enough. Now, I'm assuming Barrie was below average defensively, okay? And I know he was riding shotgun to Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. I get it, okay? I totally get it. I know it was a shortened season as well. I get it. But that doesn't change the fact the defenseman who leads all defensemen in points in a given season, they're always in the mix. Okay, and the fact that this guy didn't even get a fifth place vote, I think, is just a complete embarrassment. Honestly, I mean, you're gonna give it to. I mean, you're gonna throw I mean, Adam Pelech and Pulak, like they were super underrated this season. Don't get me wrong, but like this is the guy that led all defensemen in points. He finished the season a +5 too, and I know +5, like you know, you don't weigh plus minus too much, but if he was that bad defensively, like you think he would be in the negatives, right? Like if he was in the negatives on the plus minus and led all defensemen in points, I think there's a stronger case there. But I even looked at even strength points by defensemen too, and he was up there. He was like top 5. Like it wasn't just the power play. You know, a lot of his production was on the power play, but he was good even strength too. He put up like over 20 minutes per game as well, so he got the time on ice. Again, not saying he should have won, not saying he should have been nominated even, but at least one fifth place vote. I mean, I thought this was crazy. I still think this is crazy. Tyson Barrie will always be way more underrated than he should be, I think. Okay. Is it because people like to make a joke out of the Canadian division too? I mean, how many Canadian division teams do you have up here? You have Darnell Nurse and Jeff Petrie, Montreal, and that's it. So people like to just dunk on the Canadian division. Yeah, I don't know. I know this season, we should just be happy this season happened in the first place, but I don't know. I feel like it's a real shame that Tyson Barrie got zero recognition despite leading all defensemen in scoring. Okay, and the last thing I want to talk about, something a bit more on the lighter side. I want to talk about hipster votes. Okay, I find this so funny. Okay, I really do. Because it's like, what's going on in your head when you're voting, right? And I wanted to look at 2 examples of the Vezina Trophy because, again, I feel like the Vezina Trophy is the most clear cut. You know, I mean, it's tough when it gets votes. It's tough when it gets close when you have like 2 guys who are close in wins and they're close in save percentage, you know, but there have been years where the Vezina Trophy winner is very obvious, okay? Because you're looking at games started, you're looking at wins, and you're looking at save percentage, and you're looking at the biggest number for each of those. It's not rocket science. You don't really need to look at advanced stats too much with goaltenders. I mean, you can look at shot selection and whatnot, but I don't think it's quite as complicated as it is with players. And obviously with defensemen, as we saw in the last slide with Barrie. Clearly there's some stuff that I don't know, but again, the fact that the leading scorer amongst defensemen didn't get a single 5th place vote baffles me like crazy, just considering the nature of the award. Okay, I'm done with that though. The hipster vote. Okay, so what I mean by hipster vote is picking someone who you want to give recognition, but you give them like your first place vote. Because, okay, let's look at the 2 examples I have up there and then I'll get there. So the first one I want to look at is Carey Price's Hart Trophy winning, you know what season I'm talking about, 2014, 2015. Carey Price wins the Hart, wins the Pearson or the Lindsay or whatever it's called, wins everything, wins the Vezina, right? And that's because statistically it wasn't close. He had the most wins. He had easily the best save percentage, barring, I see Andrew Hammond there too, but sample size, right? Sample size is a big factor when it comes to the Vezina Trophy, obviously. And just the fact that Carey Price maintained a .933 over, how many games is that? 22? That's 66 games that he received credit for is incredibly impressive. It's going to be one of the greatest goalie seasons we ever see. He won the Hart Trophy. This is like something we haven't seen since Jose Theodore, funny enough. Or if you want to go farther back, Dominic Hasek, right? And how did 3 other goalies get first place votes when the statistics are so clear cut with the Vezina Trophy? there were three voters, and I think it's the general managers that vote on the Vezina, which is weird. And I'm gonna say that I don't know this for sure, but I'm gonna give like the Montreal Canadiens GM the benefit of the doubt that he's not allowed to vote for his goalie. I'm gonna assume that's a thing, but I'm not certain about it. But if you get rid of that, then there's two other general managers that think Carey Price was not the best goalie that season, which completely blows my mind because he led the league in wins. He led the league in save percentage by a lot. Like I mean, I get Devin Dubnyk's there, but when you compare that Carey Price had 8 more wins than Devin Dubnyk, it's not the same. I'm also very glad that Dubnyk got nominated that season. He got traded mid-year and then was on fire in Minnesota. Like, I think he won the Masterton that year too because he was just getting like passed around and then totally turned his career around, which I thought was really cool. But anyways, I don't think he should have gotten a first place vote for that. Pecorine, love Pecorine, but he had 3 less wins than Price and like a full 10% less in the save percentage too. Like, or not 10%, sorry. Don't make me do numbers here. So he had a 923, Price had a 933. So yeah, quite a bit less. Still a good season, but there's 3 people that say that Carey Price was not the best goalie that season, which is insane. Do you know how to read numbers? Like, if you're going to do the hipster vote, save it for your second place vote, save it for your third place vote, okay? Though I know you only get 3 votes for the Vezina, but for like the Hart Trophy and stuff, that's what your fourth and your fifth place votes are. Give it to the guys who you want to give some recognition to. Don't give your first place vote as a hipster vote. That drives me crazy. And then last season, we see the same thing with Shesterkin. Like, there were 3 general managers that say Shesterkin was not the best goalie in the league. And again, let's assume the New York general manager can't vote for his own goalie. Then there's 2 general managers that say it. The fact that that number is greater than 0 is insane, okay? Now, Igor Shesterkin didn't lead the league in wins, but he was way up there. But he dominated in save percentage. And when you compare games started and wins to his save percentage, Shesterkin was the easy winner of this award. And like this was a layup. You just got to pick Shesterkin as number 1 and then whatever for number 2 and 3. Okay, there was a lot of guys you could consider for second and third place that year. But, it's pretty clear that the first place one is Shesterkin. And it makes me wonder, are we going to see that with Connor McDavid in the Hart Trophy this season? Are we going to see him get clean house? Or is there going to be like 1 or 2 people that are like, actually, let's give it to, I don't know, Draisaitl or whoever? Like, these hipster votes are just insane. It's not that complicated, and somehow people manage to find a way to screw it up. Like, it really, really baffles me when it's like a complete layup and they still give that first place vote to a guy who's clearly not the number 1, because there was a clear number 1. Carey Price, Igor Shesterkin last season. Like, I know. It's crazy. Went on a big boomer rant about that one, but I never understood the hipster vote when it comes to your number 1 vote, at least. But I guess the counter argument there is, well, Shesterkin was going to win anyways. I'm just going to be nice with my vote. I don't know. But anyways, I'm going to stop it there because I've gone on long enough about this. That's it for today's podcast. That actually went on a bit longer than I expected. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to leave a like. Please subscribe on YouTube if you want to keep getting more of this podcast on a regular-ish basis. We'll see when the next one comes out, though. It's about to get pretty busy for me here, but really do appreciate the support on the podcast. I always do. And thanks again for listening.